Now, I like Saudi Arabia. Many friends from Saudi Arabia, they buy my condos. Oh, bing. I love them. No problem. I love them. They're fine.
He loves them.
And that's a very stark compromise to what Donald Trump campaigned on, which, of course, was calling out Saudi Arabia for their involvement of 9/11 and being the biggest financer of terrorism all around the world. That is a complete opposite view that Donald Trump has adopted ever since he became president of the United States. And this new adaptation is definitely being tested more than ever, with diplomatic relations at an all-time low, with a huge international controversy brewing around a journalist that looks like very clearly Saudi Arabia dismembered, assassinated, and took out of their embassy in Turkey in boxes. That's one of the possible scenarios that a lot of people are believing to be true for many reasons. But in this specific topic, we're going to get into the petrodollar, the U.S. oil markets correlating with Saudi Arabia. We're going to talk about how the Saudi empire is on the verge of collapse, and also how it's not only Trump, but Barack Obama and the mainstream media that allowed this brutal regime to be as prominent as they are, allowing them to get away with horrible atrocities. Now, if you haven't heard this story, it's pretty much been one of the major segments that the mainstream media has actually been talking about, mainly because it's one of their own, a mainstream media journalist, a very popular one, who went missing in the Saudi embassy inside of Turkey. Now, this man was very close to, of course, Saudi officials, once being a top advisor to them. He then became a critic of Saudi Arabia, also then closely became tied to the Turkish government and Erdogan. And this man, story is that he wanted a divorce from a wife that he had in Saudi Arabia to marry a new wife that he had in Turkey. And in order to do that, he needed to fill out some documents in the Saudi embassy. The story gets very interesting because he set up his appointment. The Saudi embassy called him back, told him to come back in 4 days. There's video footage and photos being provided by the Turkish authorities showing how Saudi diplomatic planes flew in, pictures of the individuals that came in. And this man, when he entered the Saudi embassy, never came out. There's actual surveillance footage that the Turkish government is releasing showing this journalist coming in, but he wasn't coming out. There's also a big debate stirring around the Apple iWatch that he reportedly had, and people trying to find out what happened to this man, since him and his wife were warning people that if he does not come back from the Saudi embassy, that they killed him. This man actually knew he was facing death, and I don't know what to say, but the story looks very clear that it was Saudi Arabia that dismembered him and killed him. This is what the Turkish authorities believe. This is what the mainstream media believes. This is what the story that's being pushed on us. And many people say that this is maybe even a bigger story, with this man even being potentially a CIA official. He has even closely followed and interviewed Osama bin Laden in the 1980s, and he was a very prominent journalist. And now this has become a big international scandal. Saudi Arabia is saying, yeah, he came in, but he quickly came out, even though there's no footage of him coming out, and saying that it's a big conspiracy theory. They're actually on the world stage saying, no, it's a conspiracy theory that we killed this man that we wanted to harm because he was critical of our regime. And now the situation has escalated to such a level where Saudi Arabia is allegedly threatening the United States and Donald Trump over this controversy, and threatening to have better relations with Russia, install Russian bases, take oil to $200, kill the petrodollar, stop buying U.S. weapons. And a lot of people are saying that this could rock oil markets and also threaten the global economic structure that is currently in place. And of course, a lot of this rides on the current relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which once again has been actually established by Henry Kissinger, who was the man who worked out this bigger petrodollar deal that now has the U.S. dollar dominance all around the entire world. But the economic fear-mongering that we're seeing has already been somewhat met, with stock markets plunging over the fears of sanctions in Saudi Arabia. There's a Saudi summit that was now in crisis, with many people threatening to withdraw from their summit. People online are calling for a boycott of Saudi Arabia. And even the United Kingdom is drawing up a list of potential sanctions on targets of Saudi Arabia for this missing journalist. We saw Richard Branson halt a $1 billion project with them. We're seeing people questioning the WWE's involvement with Saudi Arabia. They're also potentially even pulling out from holding their events there. Rand Paul has been one of the biggest critics of Saudi Arabia, saying that he actually wants to cut military aid and cut the missile sales to Saudi Arabia over this journalist unless he is found alive. And looking at all the details, he is definitely not going to be found alive. And props has to be given to people like Richard Branson, to people like Rand Paul, for standing up against Saudi Arabia, because once again, over this entire diplomatic crisis, the power of Saudi Arabia has only been understood not only through their threats, but also through their involvements economically, not only in the United States, but also in the mainstream media and even social media. But Donald Trump, as president of the United States, when asked what he would do about this, he specifically said, well, he's a little bit wary of it. He doesn't like hearing that this thing happens, but he has officially now announced that he won't stop arms deal to Saudi Arabia over this missing journalist. And you would think that would be the common sense thing to do. No. There's also even allegedly intelligence intercepted cables from the United States that allegedly discuss Saudi officials' plan to capture this journalist and to disappear him. We're still finding out if those intelligence cables are legit, but that is also something that we are hearing in the mainstream media. But what is really fascinating is Donald Trump made a statement saying, we can't stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. That's going to hurt us financially. Ultimately saying what Wolf Blitzer of CNN is saying. You know, when Donald Trump and Wolf Blitzer are on the same page, repeating the same talking points, you know that this is an issue that we need to pay attention to. That's extremely daunting. It's extremely terrifying, and it shows you really the true layers of control that the military-industrial complex has, to where there's a horrific international crisis, and then at the same time, Wolf Blitzer and Donald Trump, CNN, and the U.S. president are saying the same exact thing with the same talking points. We'll lose jobs. We still have to look at the rationale here. Saudi Arabia, horrible despotic regime, creating the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now in Yemen. Yeah, but we need money. That's literally what they're saying. Violating human rights, violating the human sanctity and dignity of life. Yeah, but we make money. And that is something that people should not stand for and should call out not only CNN, but especially Donald Trump for this. We saw even Donald Trump Jr. tweet that this journalist was linked with Al-Qaeda and with Osama bin Laden. So Donald Trump Jr., which I believe this was a very kind of distasteful tweet trying to put pressure off of this big diplomatic situation, is falsely claiming that this guy is Al-Qaeda. And now this journalist that is missing, yes, does have ties to Osama bin Laden because he interviewed him in the 1980s. And when he was close to the Saudi Empire, was calling out Osama bin Laden for trying to wage a global jihad. But at that time, you also have to understand, Osama bin Laden was on the payroll of the United States. The Mujahideen, which Osama bin Laden was organizing against the Russians, was supported financially and with arms by the United States. This is all just history repeating themselves. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter, covertly with the intelligence communities, armed and funded Osama bin Laden, especially in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And this guy interviewed him then. So it makes sense that yes, there was a connection, but to call him an Al-Qaeda guy when he's, it doesn't actually make sense. And the tweet was kind of distasteful, and this situation definitely needs more attention to it. And Donald Trump, again, talking about his money, we have to ask ourselves here, does this really matter like to this country? If we look at the bigger overall relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, we know that this is a relationship that is shooting ourselves in the foot. We know that even Hillary Clinton knew that Saudi Arabia with the United States were funding ISIS. Saudi Arabia was the major component of that. They were the major exporter of Wahhabism. That's why when we're seeing mosques, schools being set up in the Western world, a lot of them are Wahhabist mosques financed by Saudi Arabia. Wahhabism pushing, of course, radical Islamic terrorism, and that's why we're seeing this growth of domestic terrorism that Saudi Arabia is completely in line with. If you look at what's happening in Yemen, for freak's sakes, the United States with Saudi Arabia is fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. Saudi Arabia is the one that's tied to Al-Qaeda, Donald Trump Jr., not a journalist that you're trying to make sure is disgraced in what looks like his death. Even WikiLeaks came out with the emails showing that Hillary Clinton knew that Saudi Arabia was financing ISIS inside of Syria just a few years ago. Julian Assange of WikiLeaks even said ISIS and the Clinton Foundation, they are both funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And it wasn't just Donald Trump who's allowing this to happen. A big part of this is not only just Hillary Clinton, but also Barack Obama and his intelligence community that provided the Saudi regime not only with weapons and bombs, but with intelligence on both domestic and opposition targets in Yemen, and also enormous amounts of intelligence about domestic dissidents and radicals that were inside of Saudi Arabia. So the United States under Barack Obama, with the NSA, with their bulk data collection program, were giving Saudi Arabia intelligence about people who were against the Saudi empire inside of Saudi Arabia. And of course, this leads to a new generation of a dictatorship with the support of the United States, and is horrendous to where in the country right now, women who simply protest are being executed, who are going to have their heads chopped off by the Saudi regime. If you're a peaceful protester, just raising your voice in Saudi Arabia, if you're a gay person in Saudi Arabia, you will be murdered and beheaded. And right before a major beheading of a female activist, Facebook complied with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with the United States, and deleted a whole bunch of pages that were critical of Saudi Arabia. So just even 2 weeks ago, Facebook had an entire purge of mainly groups who were dedicated and pages who were mainly dedicated against Saudi Arabia right as they're making this move. Let's not also forget the Saudi Empire and the Saudi princes also have a huge involvement and a huge investment in Twitter and a lot of social media, and also the U.S. government. Now, it is interesting to see a lot of media report on this specific story. Some people are theorizing that this journalist could have been possibly a CIA agent. That's why there's such a big, robust coverage of this. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at Saudi Arabia, this is an issue that needs attention because they are an out-of-control empire that is spreading Wahhabism, violating human rights, not only for this journalist, but also for Rafi Badawi and all other individuals who were peaceful individuals and just want reform inside of Saudi Arabia and want to publicly express themselves and disagree with the tough totalitarian state that is Saudi Arabia. And will this bring down Saudi Arabia in the short term because of this close relationship with the petrodollar? No, I don't see Donald Trump making any significant moves, like I didn't see Barack Obama making any significant moves, even though Donald Trump promised he was going to do that. But the pressure there, I believe, is a good thing and needs to be made aware to hopefully back off this relationship just a little bit, because it is extremely detrimental not only to the world, not only to the spread of global jihadism, but to the United States more specifically. And the Saudi kingdom is a kingdom that we have to understand will collapse